For millennia, the marshlands of southern Iraq have been dismissed as one of the most overlooked corners of the ancient world, a landscape of reeds and shallow water that most people assumed held nothing but fishermen and buffalo herders with no real connection to the civilization that once ruled the same ground. Then geneticists went looking for the genetic footprint of the Sumerians, the people who invented writing, built the first cities on Earth, and vanished from history more than 3,000 years ago. And they found something nobody expected sitting quietly in the DNA of the people still living in exactly the same marshes today. Before getting into what researchers actually found, it's worth being precise about something the popular framing of this story usually gets wrong. Nobody has ever successfully extracted and sequenced ancient DNA directly from the skeletal remains of an actual Sumerian person. Iraq's climate, hot, humid for parts of the year, and often waterlogged in the exact regions where Sumerian cities once stood, is brutal on the preservation of ancient genetic material, and to date, no confirmed Sumerian-era genome has been successfully recovered and published anywhere in the scientific literature. That might sound like it undercuts the entire premise of this story, but it actually makes what researchers did accomplish considerably more interesting, because instead of comparing modern Iraqis directly against an ancient genome pulled from a 5,000-year-old skeleton, they had to solve the puzzle from the other direction entirely, working forward from the living population back toward the ancient one, using genetic detective work rather than a straightforward side-by-side comparison of old bones against modern blood. To understand why that approach even made sense, and why anyone would think it could work at all, you have to understand who the Sumerians actually were and why their origins have been argued over by historians for more than a century. Sumer emerged in the southern part of Mesopotamia, in the marshy delta region, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet, before draining into the Persian Gulf, sometime around the 4th millennium BCE. This was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most consequential civilizations in human history, and its significance is difficult to overstate given how much of what followed in the ancient Near East built directly on its foundations. The Sumerians built the first true cities, places like Uruk, Ur, Eridu, and Lagash, with populations large enough and organized enough to require genuine urban administration, coordinated labor for irrigation projects, formal legal codes, and a class of professional scribes trained specifically to keep track of it all. They developed cuneiform, the earliest known writing system on the planet, initially used for the deeply unglamorous purpose of tracking grain shipments, tax obligations, and temple inventories, long before it ever evolved into a tool sophisticated enough to record law codes, epic poetry like the Epic of Gilgamesh, and detailed astronomical observations that would influence timekeeping systems still in use today. They built the earliest known ziggurats, massive step temple platforms that dominated the skyline of their cities, developed sophisticated irrigation and canal systems to manage the unpredictable, often violent flooding of two major rivers, and laid down legal, religious, and administrative traditions that later Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian civilizations would directly inherit, adapt, and build upon for another 2,000 years. And then, by around 2000 BCE, the Sumerian language itself had effectively died out as a spoken tongue among ordinary people, surviving only as a scholarly and religious language used by scribes and priests, in much the same way Latin persisted in medieval European monasteries and universities long after nobody spoke it at home or in the marketplace. Sumerian civilization was gradually absorbed into the broader Akkadian-speaking world that rose alongside and eventually eclipsed it, then successively ruled by Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians following Cyrus the Great's conquest, Greeks under Alexander and his successors, Parthians, Sassanid Persians, Romans at the far western edge of their influence, and eventually Arab Muslim conquerors, beginning in the 7th century CE, followed centuries later by Mongol invasion, Ottoman rule, and British colonial administration in the 20th century before Iraq's modern independence. That is an extraordinary, almost dizzying amount of political and cultural turnover layered directly on top of one specific patch of river delta over the course of roughly 5,000 years of continuous, densely recorded human history. The obvious question this raised for anthropologists and geneticists alike was whether any biological population living in that region today could plausibly trace direct ancestry back to the people who built the very first cities on Earth, or whether all of that turnover, all those armies and administrations and resettlements, had simply erased any meaningful genetic thread connecting past to present entirely. For a long time, the working assumption among many historians leaned fairly heavily toward erasure, and it's easy to understand why. Given how many different empires had controlled Mesopotamia and how many population movements, forced deportations, invasions, and voluntary migrations had passed through the region across 5 millennia, it seemed entirely reasonable to expect that any direct genetic connection to the Sumerians specifically would have been thoroughly diluted, mixed beyond recognition, or replaced outright by later arrivals. There was also a specific, long-standing folk theory attached to one particular Iraqi population that made this exact question considerably more interesting and considerably more testable than it might have been otherwise. Deep in the wetlands of southern Iraq and the region historically known as the Mesopotamian marshes lives a population known as the Marsh Arabs, or Madan in Arabic. For centuries, this community has lived a genuinely distinctive lifestyle built directly around the wetland environment itself, constructing elaborate reed houses and even entire artificial floating islands out of packed reeds, herding water buffalo through the shallow waterways, fishing extensively, and moving by narrow, gracefully curved reed canoes through the same channels and lagoons that once wound past the ruins of ancient Sumerian cities like Ur and Uruk, both of which sit at the edge of, or historically within, this same broader marshland region. Popular tradition in Iraq had long held a curious and somewhat internally contradictory belief about this specific population, that the Marsh Arabs were actually a relatively recent foreign population, believed by some to have arrived from the Indian subcontinent alongside the introduction of water buffalo herding and rice cultivation, both technologies genuinely and historically associated with South Asian agricultural traditions reaching into Mesopotamia through trade contact. If that folk theory were true, it would mean the population living closest, both geographically and culturally, to the historical heart of ancient Sumer had actually arrived relatively recently in historical terms. With no deep ancestral connection to the Sumerians whatsoever, essentially strangers who had simply settled into an abandoned ancient landscape long after its original builders were gone. This is exactly the question a team of researchers set out to test directly, publishing their results in the journal BMC Evolutionary Biology in 2011, in a study led by geneticist Nadia Al-Zahari, rather than trying to somehow recover an ancient Sumerian genome, which, as already noted, simply does not exist in any confirmed published form anywhere in the scientific record. The research team took a different, more indirect but genuinely rigorous methodological approach. They collected and analyzed Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA samples from 143 Marsh Arab individuals, comparing that data carefully against a large sample of broader Iraqi control populations drawn from outside the marshland region, and then situated both data sets within the wider, well-documented context of genetic variation across the Middle East, the broader Fertile Crescent, and South Asia. The underlying logic was straightforward and testable. If the popular folk theory were correct, and the Marsh Arabs really were relatively recent arrivals from South Asia who happened to settle into the marshlands alongside their water buffalo, their genetic profile should show a clear, substantial South Asian genetic signature, distinct from the surrounding Iraqi population, reflecting that comparatively recent, historically documented style of migration. That is not what the data actually showed once the samples were fully analyzed. The genetic analysis revealed that Marsh Arab paternal and maternal lineages were overwhelmingly dominated by what researchers describe as an autochthonous Middle Eastern genetic component, essentially a genetic profile deeply rooted in the region itself for a very long time, with only weak minor genetic contributions traceable to South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, contributions that were more evident on the maternal side than the paternal side, but in both cases considerably too limited in scale to support the idea that this population represented a substantial, relatively recent foreign migration displacing or replacing whatever population had lived in the marshes before them. The researchers went further still, examining specific Y chromosome subclades in much finer detail, and found something genuinely striking buried in that more granular layer of the data. A specific branch within haplogroup J1, identified in the study as J1 page 08, showed clear statistical evidence of a local population expansion dated to a period that aligns closely with the era of Sumerian city-state development in southern Mesopotamia. In simpler terms, the genetic data pointed toward a real, measurable population boom occurring in this specific geographic region during roughly the same window of time that Sumerian civilization itself was flourishing and expanding its network of cities, precisely the kind of genetic signature researchers would expect to find if they were looking directly at the biological descendants of the population that built those cities in the first place, rather than at a population that arrived centuries or millennia later. Alongside this, the researchers also identified a second, considerably older Y chromosome lineage, J1M267, present at lower overall frequency within the sample, which appeared to reflect an even more ancient genetic connection linking the Marsh Arabs to populations further north in Mesopotamia, suggesting a layer of deep regional continuity stretching back even further into prehistory than the specific Sumerian period itself. The study's authors were also careful to directly address the specific historical claim about water buffalo herding and rice cultivation arriving from South Asia, technologies that genuinely did spread into Mesopotamia from that broader direction historically, and this is not in dispute. Their genetic data indicated that while these specific agricultural practices likely were introduced into the marshes from outside the region, probably via sustained trade and cultural contact, rather than any large-scale migration of people, that technological introduction appears to have had only a marginal, comparatively minor effect on the underlying genetic makeup of the indigenous population already living in the marshes at the time. In other words, the Marsh Arabs appear to have adopted new farming techniques and animal husbandry practices from South Asian contact without. That cultural exchange being accompanied by anything close to a demographically significant wave of South Asian immigration substantially reshaping their actual ancestry. As the study's authors put it directly in their published conclusions, if the Marsh Arabs really are descendants of the ancient Sumerians, then the genetic evidence available strongly suggests the Sumerians themselves were most likely an autochthonous population, indigenous to Mesopotamia for a very long time before recorded history begins, rather than a population carrying substantial Indian or South Asian ancestry, a conclusion that directly addressed a genuinely old and previously unresolved question in Mesopotamian archaeology about where the Sumerians themselves had originally come from in the first place. This finding connects directly to a broader, considerably older academic debate historians and archaeologists have long referred to as the Sumerian problem, essentially the puzzle of why Sumerian, as a language, appears to be a genuine linguistic isolate, meaning it shows no clearly established relationship to any other known language family, ancient or modern, anywhere on Earth. This stands in sharp contrast to Akkadian and its various successor languages, including Babylonian and Assyrian dialects, all of which fit clearly and comfortably within the broader Semitic language family still spoken across large parts of the Middle East today. This genuine linguistic mystery led some earlier generations of historians to speculate that the Sumerians themselves might have originally migrated into Mesopotamia from somewhere else entirely, perhaps from the Iranian Plateau, perhaps from further afield, bringing a genuinely foreign, unrelated language with them into a region that would otherwise have been dominated entirely by Semitic-speaking populations from the very beginning. The genetic evidence recovered from the Marsh Arabs pushes directly against that particular theory, suggesting instead that the population responsible for building and running Sumerian civilization was likely already firmly established in southern Mesopotamia for a very long time before recorded history begins, rather than representing a relatively late arrival from some distant, currently unidentified, ancestral homeland. It's worth being genuinely precise here about exactly how strong this specific genetic evidence actually is, because this is a case where scientific caution matters considerably more than a simple, satisfying headline. The Marsh Arabs are widely considered by archaeologists and historians studying this specific question to be the population with the strongest plausible genetic and cultural continuity to the ancient inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia, given their continuous documented habitation of the exact same wetland environment for an extraordinarily long stretch of recorded and archaeologically confirmed history. But strongest plausible link is not the same claim as confirmed direct descent, verified against an actual ancient genome, precisely because no Sumerian-era genome currently exists anywhere to test that claim against directly and conclusively. What the 2011 study actually demonstrates with genuine scientific rigor and appropriate methodological caution is that the Marsh Arab population shows deep indigenous genetic roots specifically in the region where Sumerian civilization arose. With a documented local population expansion whose timing lines up remarkably well with the Sumerian period itself, and minimal evidence of the kind of large-scale foreign population replacement that popular folklore had long assumed occurred within this specific community. This research sits within a much broader and genuinely fascinating picture of Iraqi genetic diversity more generally, because Iraq as a whole represents one of the most historically layered, ethnically diverse countries anywhere in the Middle East, a direct consequence of its position at the crossroads of Mesopotamian, Persian, Arab, Turkic, and Kurdish history, all converging within the same relatively compact geographic space over thousands of years. A separate, detailed study published in the journal PLOS One in 2017 examined why chromosome data across 5 distinct ethnic communities in northern Iraq, specifically Arabs, Kurds, Turkmens, Syriacs, and Yazidis, collecting genetic samples from a total of 500 individuals across these communities. That research confirmed exactly what the region's turbulent, layered history would predict: genuine, measurable genetic diversity existing between these different ethnic communities, reflecting their distinct historical trajectories, migration patterns, and varying degrees of intermarriage with neighboring populations across many centuries. At the same time, the same study also found meaningful evidence of shared underlying genetic continuity connecting all of these groups back to what researchers describe as the original genetic stock of the broader Mesopotamian population, a foundational genetic layer that appears to have contributed in varying proportions depending on the specific community to the ethnogenesis of several genuinely distinct populations that developed across the wider Near East over subsequent millennia of recorded history. Broader population genetics research examining Iraq as a whole, beyond just these 2 specific studies, has generally found that Iraqi Arab populations tend to cluster genetically most closely with other Levantine populations, including Lebanese, Syrian, Jordanian, and Druze communities, reflecting shared deep ancestry connected to ancient Levantine Neolithic farming populations layered together with genetic contributions traceable further east to ancient Iranian populations as well, a reasonable and expected outcome given Mesopotamia's geographic position directly between the Levant and the Iranian Plateau throughout the entirety of ancient history. Iraqi Kurdish populations, by contrast, tend to show somewhat closer genetic affinity specifically to populations in central Iran, consistent with their own distinct historical and linguistic connections to the broader Iranian-speaking world, stretching back many centuries. Layered across both of these broader population groups, researchers have identified a widespread, based on foundational genetic contribution from ancient Iranian-related Neolithic ancestry, found broadly across Middle Eastern populations generally and not unique to Iraq specifically, alongside smaller, more localized genetic contributions connected to ancient Eastern hunter-gatherer populations and various more recent historical admixture events tied directly to the long, genuinely dizzying list of empires and migrations that have passed through the region across the full span of recorded history. What emerges from putting all of this research together, rather than looking at any single study in isolation, is a genuinely nuanced and, in many honest ways, more satisfying answer than a simple, clean yes. Modern Iraqis are directly and exclusively descended from the Sumerians headline would suggest on its own. The genetic evidence does not point toward a single, unbroken, entirely unmixed population that has remained biologically untouched since the days of Uruk and Ur first rose along the riverbank. Given the sheer number of empires, migrations, conquests, and centuries of sustained trade contact that have passed through Mesopotamia across roughly 5,000 years of continuous, well-documented history, that kind of total biological isolation would represent a genuine historical anomaly. And there's no strong evidence currently available that it actually occurred anywhere in Iraq at that scale, including in the marshes themselves. What the genetic evidence does support, with real scientific rigor and appropriate nuance, is something considerably more specific and arguably considerably more interesting than a simple clean claim of unbroken descent. A documented deep indigenous genetic root system embedded specifically in the population of southern Iraq's marshlands, one old enough and localized enough to align meaningfully with the timing of Sumerian civilization itself, layered underneath many subsequent centuries of regional admixture, migration, and cultural transformation that reshaped the wider Iraqi population without ever fully erasing that older, foundational genetic signature sitting underneath it all. This distinction matters considerably because it reframes the entire question in a way that's actually more historically accurate than the simpler, more viral-friendly version of the claim that tends to circulate online. Modern Iraq is not a single, genetically uniform population directly descended from one ancient civilization in some clean, unbroken line stretching straight down from Sumer to the present day. It's a genuinely layered mosaic instead. Arab, Kurdish, Turkmen, Assyrian, Yazidi, and other communities, each carrying its own distinct history of migration, contact, and admixture across the centuries, all sitting on top of and partially derived from a genuinely ancient indigenous genetic foundation that traces back to some of the very first farming and urban populations to ever settle permanently in the Fertile Crescent. The Marsh Arabs specifically appear to represent the clearest surviving genetic thread connecting that ancient foundational population to people alive in Iraq today, not because they somehow escaped every single wave of historical change that swept through the wider region over 5 millennia, but because their specific continuous habitation of an unusually isolated wetland environment appears to have genuinely limited the scale of genetic admixture they experienced compared to populations living in more heavily trafficked, more frequently conquered, and more thoroughly urbanized parts of the country over the same long stretch of time. There's also a broader lesson embedded in exactly how this specific piece of research had to be conducted in the first place, and it's one that applies well beyond Iraq alone. In an ideal scientific scenario, researchers studying a question like this would simply extract and sequence ancient DNA directly from confirmed Sumerian-era skeletal remains, then compare that genetic data directly against modern Iraqi populations, exactly the kind of straightforward ancient versus modern comparison that has become increasingly common and increasingly precise in genetic research, examining European and East Asian population history over roughly the past decade of rapid technological advancement in this field. Iraq's specific climate and preservation conditions have made that more direct, more straightforward approach considerably more difficult to pursue, forcing researchers instead to build their case indirectly through careful, methodical analysis of modern population genetics combined thoughtfully with historical linguistics, archaeological evidence, and long-standing folk tradition, triangulating a genuinely evidence-based answer from multiple independent directions at once, rather than simply settling the entire question with one single definitive ancient genome recovered from the ground. That represents a genuinely more difficult scientific problem to solve carefully, and the fact that researchers have still managed to build a coherent, evidence-based case using this considerably more indirect approach says something real and encouraging about how far population genetics has advanced as a scientific field, even in regions where the underlying ancient biological material itself simply hasn't survived in a form current science can recover, and read directly from the remains themselves, put all of it together, and here's what the actual currently available evidence supports, stated plainly and without overstatement in either direction. The population living today in the marshlands of southern Iraq in almost exactly the same wetland environment, where Sumerian civilization first emerged more than 5,000 years ago, carries a genetic profile deeply rooted in that specific region, showing a documented, statistically detectable local population expansion, whose timing aligns closely with the historical rise of Sumerian city-states, and showing only minor genetic contribution from the outside populations that popular folklore had long assumed replaced the region's original inhabitants entirely. That doesn't mean every single person living in Iraq today can trace a direct unbroken genetic line back to one specific named Sumerian ancestor. It means the deep indigenous genetic thread connecting ancient Mesopotamia to the people living there right now was never as thoroughly, completely erased by 5,000 years of conquest, migration, and empire as many historians had previously assumed it would be. Somewhere in the reed houses and floating islands scattered across the Mesopotamian marshes, in a landscape that has changed remarkably little in outward appearance since cuneiform tablets were first pressed into wet clay along the same riverbanks, a genuine, measurable genetic echo of the world's very first cities is still quietly present in the people living there today, not because they were somehow spared from history's constant churn, but because history, in this one specific, waterlogged corner of the ancient world, turned out to run considerably deeper and hold on considerably tighter than anyone had fully expected it to.